The motel was barely a blip on the highway. A cracked neon sign flickered weakly, one letter permanently extinguished, making it red Mo_L. The asphalt lot was riddled with potholes that could swallow a wheel if you weren't careful. The building itself looked like it had been abandoned a decade ago and hastily reopened without so much as a fresh coat of paint. I almost drove past it. Honestly, I should have. But the gaslight on my dashboard was glowing an angry orange, and I hadn't seen another sign of civilization in hours. The inside smelled like mildew and mothballs, with a faint undertone of something metallic that I couldn't place. The clerk was waiting behind the counter, a wiry man with hollow cheeks and watery eyes that didn't quite meet mine. He was flipping through a yellowed magazine when I walked in, but his head snapped up at the sound of the door chime. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice dry and papery, like it didn't get much use. I nodded, trying not to wrinkle my nose at the smell. "Yeah, just for the night." "How much?" He hesitated for a second too long, then rattled off a number that felt suspiciously high for a place like this, but I wasn't in the mood to argue. I handed over some cash, and he slid a tarnished key across the counter. "Room 5, he said. "You'll like that one." Something about the way he said it made my skin prickle, but I shrugged it off. Small-town weirdos, I told myself. You meet them on every road trip. The room was halfway down the first floor, its number hanging crookedly on the door. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of something long past its prime. The walls were an ugly shade of beige, peeling in places to reveal water-stained plaster beneath. The bedspread was a floral monstrosity that looked like it had last been washed in the previous century. The lamp by the bed buzzed faintly when I turned it on, casting a sickly yellow glow. I tossed my bag on the bed and sat down, the springs creaking ominously under my weight. The room had all the charm of a funeral home, but I told myself it was just for a night. I'd be back on the road by morning, and this place would fade into the background of forgettable pit stops. It wasn't until I went to hang up my jacket that I noticed the closet. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness beyond. A faint, almost imperceptible sound came from inside, like the scuttling of tiny claws. I froze, my hand halfway to the doorknob, every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone. But curiosity is a funny thing. It makes you ignore the voice in your head that tells you something isn't right. I pulled the door open. The closet was empty. No hangers, no shelves, not even a rod for hanging clothes. Just a bare, narrow space with walls the same beige as the rest of the room. But as I stepped closer, I noticed the scratches. They were faint at first, just shallow grooves etched into the wood near the bottom of the doorframe. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized they weren't random. They formed letters. "Don't let them see you." A chill ran down my spine. I stared at the words, my mind racing to make sense of them. Who'd written this? And why? I glanced over my shoulder at the rest of the room, suddenly hyper-aware of how quiet it was. Too quiet. I shut the closet door quickly and tried to laugh it off. People did weird things in motels, I told myself. Maybe it was a prank, or some unhinged guest with a flair for the dramatic. Either way, it wasn't my problem. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. I kept glancing at the closet, half expecting the door to creak open on its own. By the time I climbed into bed, I was exhausted, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside made me jolt awake. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I was staring at the ceiling in the dark, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't immediately place. Then I heard it. Scratching. It was faint at first, so faint I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But it grew louder, more insistent, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the closet. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. The sound stopped. For a long moment, the room was silent again, the kind of silence that felt alive, like it was holding its breath with me. Then the scratching started again, faster this time, more frantic. "Hello," I called, my voice cracking. It felt stupid as soon as I said it. Who was I expecting to answer? The scratching stopped again. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. and then, slowly, the closet door began to move. It didn't swing open all the way, just enough to reveal that sliver of darkness again. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare, waiting for anything to come out of that black void. But nothing did. The door stayed like that for what felt like hours, barely open, taunting me. Finally, I mustered the courage to get out of bed. My legs felt like jelly as I crossed the room, every step a monumental effort. I reached out, my hand trembling as I pushed the door shut. This time I locked it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound made me jump, every shadow felt like it was watching me. By the time the first rays of sunlight filtered through the grimy curtains, I was already packed and ready to leave. But as I opened the door to go, something stopped me. Scrawled across the inside of the closet door, in jagged letters that hadn't been there before, were the words they know. My gut told me there was something else waiting for me, something worse than I'd already seen, but I didn't stick around to find out. I slammed the motel room door shut behind me, practically sprinting to my car. The key shook in my hand as I jammed it into the ignition. The engine stuttered once before roaring to life, and I peeled out of the parking lot like my life depended on it. The whole time I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror. I half expected to see someone or something standing in the doorway of room 5, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the rundown motel fading into the distance as I sped down the empty highway. I drove for miles without stopping, the unease clinging to me like a second skin. Every time I passed another car or a stretch of woods, I felt like I was being watched. My pulse thudded in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving the motel hadn't actually solved anything. It was like I'd taken whatever was wrong with that room along for the ride. By the time I reached the next gas station, I was running on fumes. The place was a small, dingy shack with a single pump and a hand-painted open sign hanging crookedly in the window. The clerk inside barely looked up as I walked in, just nodded toward the self-serve coffee machine in the corner. I grabbed a cup, hoping the caffeine might steady my nerves, and went to pay. "That all?" the clerk asked, his voice monotone. "Yeah," I said, handing over a crumpled bill. Then, on a whim, I asked, "You ever hear anything about that motel down the road? The one with the busted sign?" The clerk finally looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You stayed there?" "Just for the night," I said, trying to sound casual. "Weird place, though." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached under the counter and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, lighting one with a shaky hand. "People around here don't talk about that place," he said finally, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Best you forget you were ever there." "That bad?" I asked, half joking to mask how on edge I felt. "Worse," he said. "Seen folks check in and never come out. Those that do, they're not right after." Like something followed them, his eyes met mine, and there was something in his gaze, fear, maybe, or recognition. "If I were you, I'd keep driving. Don't look back." I nodded, my mouth dry. I wanted to ask more, but the clerk had already turned his attention back to his cigarette, like the conversation was over. I left the station feeling worse than when I'd arrived. The highway stretched on endlessly, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The further I drove, the more the unease settled into a dull, persistent thrum. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that there was no way a stupid motel could actually be dangerous. But then I started noticing things. It was small at first. The faint scratching sound that seemed to come from the back seat, even though I was alone. The way the shadows on the road seemed to stretch toward me, like they were trying to grab the car. Once I glanced at my rearview mirror and saw something or someone sitting in the back seat. But when I whipped around to look, the seat was empty. I stopped at a diner around noon, desperate for a distraction. The place was quiet, the kind of old-school greasy spoon where the menu hadn't changed in 50 years. The waitress was friendly enough, but she kept glancing at me like she knew something I didn't. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said as she poured me a cup of coffee. "Something like that," I muttered, stirring cream into the cup just for something to do. She lingered for a moment, like she wanted to say more, but eventually walked away. I ate in silence, the unease growing stronger with every passing minute. By the time I paid my bill and got back in the car, I was a bundle of nerves. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I drove aimlessly, too spooked to stick to a plan. I avoided motels altogether, opting instead to sleep in my car at a rest stop when night fell. It wasn't comfortable, but at least I felt marginally safer with the doors locked and the keys in my lap. That night, the dream started. I was back in room 5, standing in front of the closet. The door was open, and the darkness inside seemed alive, shifting and writhing like a nest of snakes. I couldn't see what was moving, but I could hear it, the same frantic scratching I'd heard before. And then, slowly, something began to emerge. It was a hand, thin and pale, with fingers too long to be human. Its nails were jagged, coated in something dark and wet. Another hand followed, then a face, its features obscured by shadow, but I could see its eyes gleaming, hungry, and locked on me. I woke up gasping, the sound of scratching still ringing in my ears. The car was dark, the windows fogged over from my breath. For a moment I thought I was still dreaming. Then I saw the handprint. It was on the inside of the windshield, pressed into the glass like someone or something had been watching me while I slept. The handprint on the windshield was just the beginning of something much worse. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, staring at the faint outline of fingers smeared across the fogged glass. My breath caught in my throat as I reached out, trembling, to touch it. The print was still wet, beads of moisture clinging to the grooves where the fingers had pressed. It wasn't mine, and I was sure as hell alone, or I was supposed to be. I checked the back seat again, twisting around so fast I nearly knocked the keys out of my lap. Empty. Just crumpled fast food wrappers and an old hoodie I'd been meaning to throw out. But the unease was growing, a tight, buzzing tension that made my skin crawl. Get a grip, I whispered to myself. My voice sounded too loud in the enclosed space, breaking the fragile silence. I turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life, and pulled out of the rest stop without bothering to check my mirrors. I didn't want to know what I might see. The road stretched on, endless and unchanging under the dim glow of my headlights. The night was heavy, oppressive, as if the darkness itself was pressing down on the car. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror despite myself, half expecting to see those gleaming eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind me. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, it was hard to tell. The highway had taken on an otherworldly quality, the kind of isolation that made you question if you were the only person left alive. The few towns I passed were dark, their streetlights flickering like dying embers. I didn't dare stop. That's when the radio started acting up. It was subtle at first, just a faint crackle of static beneath the music. I thought maybe I was driving out of range, but the song playing never cut out completely. It just warped, slowing down in places like an old record. Then I heard it, a voice, faint and whispering, buried beneath the static. Don't let them see you. I slammed my hand against the power button, silencing the radio. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears as I stared at the glowing console, half expecting it to turn back on by itself. It didn't, but the silence that followed was worse. It felt alive, coiled tight like a predator waiting to strike. The headlights flickered once, then twice. For a brief moment, the road ahead was plunged into darkness, and my stomach dropped. When the lights came back on, I saw it. There was someone or something standing in the middle of the road. I swerved instinctively, the tires screeching as the car fishtailed. I fought for control, my heart slamming against my ribcage, and managed to pull over onto the shoulder. The engine idled as I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I glanced back at the road, but whatever I'd seen was gone. My breathing was ragged, and my hands shook as I shifted into park. It had been there. I wasn't imagining it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its head had been tilted at an odd angle, like it was studying me. I debated whether to get out and look, but the thought made my skin crawl. Instead, I stayed in the car, scanning the road and the dark woods that flanked it. The headlights barely penetrated the tree line, leaving shadows that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. Something moved in the corner of my eye, a blur of motion near the edge of the trees. I whipped my head toward it, but there was nothing there, just darkness and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. And then came the scratching. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the roof of the car. My stomach clenched as I gripped the steering wheel, too afraid to move. The sound dragged along the metal, slow and deliberate, like nails or claws scraping against the surface. My mind raced, torn between the primal urge to flee and the paralyzing fear of what I might see if I got out. The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that was almost worse. My breath came in shallow gasps as I sat there, waiting for anything to happen. Then, from somewhere behind me, came a faint tapping on the rear window. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My hands tightened on the wheel, my nails digging into the leather as the tapping continued, slow and deliberate. It wasn't frantic or aggressive. It was calculated, like whoever or whatever was back there wanted me to know they could reach me anytime they wanted. When the tapping stopped, I finally worked up the courage to glance in the rearview mirror. The glass was fogged over again, obscuring the view, but I could make out faint smudges. Handprints. Dozens of them, pressed against the inside of the rear window. My stomach lurched, and I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires squealing as I sped back onto the highway. The smudges were still there, faint but unmistakable, and no amount of frantic wiping with my sleeve could erase them. I drove through the night, stopping for nothing, until the first hints of dawn painted the horizon. The light should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Instead, it revealed something I hadn't noticed before: scratches on the inside of the windshield. Tiny, deliberate marks, clustered together near the edge of the glass. They formed a single word: run. It wasn't a warning. It was a command. The scratches on the windshield were just another piece of the nightmare, pushing me further into a reality I didn't want to face. I didn't stop driving until the sun was fully up, casting long shadows across the endless highway. But even in daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, a flicker of black darting through the tree line, keeping pace with the car. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of exhaustion, but the handprints on the glass and the scratches told a different story. Around mid-morning, I pulled into a small diner on the outskirts of a town I didn't bother to note the name of. The place was old, but clean, with a cheerful waitress who greeted me like I was the first customer she'd seen in days. I picked a booth in the corner, where I could watch the door, and ordered coffee I didn't want and pancakes I couldn't stomach. The waitress brought the coffee with a smile. "Rough night?" she asked, glancing at the dark circles under my eyes. You could say that I muttered, forcing a weak smile in return. She lingered for a moment, her gaze flicking to the car parked outside. Her expression shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, but I caught it a shadow of unease, quickly replaced with forced cheer. "Let me know if you need anything else," she said, and walked away before I could respond. The coffee was bitter, but I drank it anyway, hoping the caffeine would chase away the fog in my head. As I sat there, I became increasingly aware of how quiet the diner was, the kind of quiet that didn't feel right. There were no other customers, no clatter of dishes in the kitchen, just the faint hum of a fluorescent light overhead. Then I noticed the booth across from me. At first glance it looked empty, but as I stared, I realized there was something off about the way the seat cushion was indented, as if someone was sitting there. My pulse quickened as I leaned forward, my breath catching when I noticed the faintest outline of a figure. Not a person exactly, but an absence like the air itself had been pressed into the shape of something that didn't belong. I blinked, and it was gone. I left the diner in a hurry, throwing a crumpled bill on the table without waiting for change. The waitress didn't try to stop me, but I felt her eyes on my back as I walked out. When I got to the car, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. The scratches on the windshield caught the sunlight, and I could see them more clearly now. They weren't random, they formed letters, overlapping and chaotic, but unmistakable. "Help me." I almost didn't get back in the car. Every instinct screamed at me to ditch it and keep walking, but where would I go? I was miles from anything resembling civilization, and my legs felt like jelly. Reluctantly, I climbed back inside, locking the doors behind me. The next stretch of road was a blur. I kept the radio off, the silence pressing against my eardrums like a weight. Occasionally I glanced at the scratches on the windshield, hoping they'd disappear like the figure in the diner. They didn't. By late afternoon, the road began to climb, winding through a dense forest that cast long shadows even in daylight. The trees were so close to the edge of the road that their branches scratched against the car as I drove. The sound made me flinch every time, reminding me of the scratching from the roof the night before. Then I saw a figure standing at the edge of the road just ahead. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs bent at angles that shouldn't have been possible. It didn't move as I approached, just stood there, watching. My foot hovered over the brake, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. Instead, I swerved to avoid it, gripping the wheel tightly as the tires skimmed the edge of the asphalt. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the figure was gone. I thought I was losing my mind until I noticed the scratches on the inside of the driver's side window. They hadn't been there before. Fresh and jagged, as if made in desperation, they spelled out one word: beware. I didn't have time to process it before the car jolted violently, the steering wheel jerking out of my hands. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the air, and I realized too late that I'd drifted too close to the guardrail. The tires skidded on loose gravel, and the car spun out, crashing into the barrier with a sickening crunch. For a moment, everything was still. The engine sputtered, the front end crumpled against the guardrail, steam hissing from the hood. My head throbbed where it had hit the steering wheel, and my hands trembled as I fumbled with the seatbelt. The forest around me was silent, too silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint, metallic ticking of the engine cooling. And then I heard it. The scratching. This time it wasn't coming from the roof or the windows. It was inside the car. The scratching inside the car was just the start of something far worse. It wasn't random or frantic. It was deliberate, paced, as though something or someone was dragging their nails across the interior, waiting for me to notice. I froze, my hand gripping the door handle. The sound was coming from the back seat. My first instinct was to bolt, to throw the door open and run into the woods, but the rational part of me knew better. The woods were dark and endless, and whatever was in the car might be worse out there. Slowly, I turned my head to look over my shoulder. At first, the back seat looked empty. Just the old hoodie and trash I'd noticed earlier. But then, in the dim light filtering through the cracked windshield, I saw it. A figure, hunched and gaunt, pressed into the far corner of the seat. Its limbs were too long, its skin waxy and pale, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. It didn't have a face, not exactly just a smooth expanse of skin where its features should have been, as though someone had erased them. But it had eyes. Two black pits, bottomless and staring straight at me. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The thing tilted its head, the motion slow and jerky, like it wasn't used to moving. The scratching sound came again, and I realized it was dragging a single, impossibly long nail across the upholstery, carving shallow grooves into the fabric. Then it spoke. Or maybe it didn't. The words weren't spoken aloud, they were in my head, a voice so cold and hollow it made my teeth ache. You shouldn't have seen. The words reverberated through me, rattling in my skull like loose change. My instincts finally kicked in, and I lunged for the door handle, throwing it open and tumbling out onto the gravel. I hit the ground hard, the impact jarring my already aching body, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and ran, stumbling toward the woods. Behind me, the car door creaked open. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound of footsteps followed me, slow, deliberate, crunching through the gravel. They were heavier than they should have been for something so emaciated, each step making the ground seem to tremble beneath me. The trees closed in around me as I ran, branches clawing at my face and clothes. The air was thick and cold, stifling, as though the forest itself didn't want me there. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. The footsteps were still behind me, unhurried but relentless. I tripped on a root and went down hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Pain lanced through my ankle, and when I tried to stand, it gave out beneath me. I clawed at the ground, dragging myself forward, the leaves and dirt cold and damp against my skin. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. I lay there, my chest heaving, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. The forest seemed to hold its breath, every shadow watching, waiting. A hand closed around my ankle. I screamed, kicking out with my good leg, but the grip was like iron. It yanked me backward, dragging me through the dirt and leaves, and I twisted around, desperate to see what was pulling me. The thing from the car loomed over me, its featureless face inches from mine. Up close, the pits where its eyes should have been were endless, swirling with something dark and malevolent. You let them see, it said, or thought, or willed into my mind. Now they'll never stop. I fought with everything I had, clawing at the ground, the roots, its skeletal hand, but it was no use. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees bending and twisting as though they were alive, their branches reaching for me. And then it stopped. The hand released my ankle, and I was suddenly alone. The forest was still, the air heavy with the scent of earth and decay. My head spun as I sat up, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. There was nothing. No footsteps, no scratching, no sign of the thing that had dragged me here. But when I looked down at my ankle, I saw the mark. A perfect imprint of a hand burned into my skin, black and smoldering. I staggered to my feet, the pain in my ankle forgotten as I hobbled back toward the road. The car was still there, its engine idling, steam curling from the crumpled hood. But the scratches on the windshield had multiplied, spreading across the glass like spider webs. The words were no longer coherent, just jumbled letters and symbols etched in chaotic patterns. As I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking, I glanced at the rearview mirror one last time. The back seat was empty. I drove for hours, the pain in my ankle a dull throb. The road seemed endless, stretching into eternity, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going in circles. Every mile felt the same trees, the same shadows, the same oppressive silence. And then I saw it. The motel. Its cracked neon sign flickered weakly in the distance, the word Mo_L glowing against the encroaching night. I hadn't turned around. I was sure of it. But somehow I was back. Finding myself back at the motel was like being plunged into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. My stomach churned as I pulled into the cracked lot, the car sputtering and dying, as if it too knew it had reached the end of the line. The headlights flickered and went out, leaving me bathed in the sickly glow of the failing neon sign. I didn't want to get out. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay in the car, to lock the doors and wait for the sun to rise. But deep down I knew the sun wouldn't help me. Not here. I reached for my phone, desperate for some connection to the outside world, but the screen stayed dark no matter how many times I pressed the power button. Dead. Of course it was. I threw it onto the passenger seat in frustration and glanced at the motel. Room 5's door was open. Not just unlocked, not ajar, it was wide open, the darkness inside yawning like a black hole. I could feel it pulling at me, an invisible force that made my skin crawl. I told myself not to go in, that I didn't need answers badly enough to step foot inside that room again. But my legs didn't listen. They moved on their own, dragging me out of the car and across the lot, gravel crunching underfoot. The air grew colder with each step, biting at my skin, even though the night had been warm moments before. By the time I reached the doorway, my breath was visible, fogging the still air in front of me. The room looked exactly as I'd left it, the same peeling walls, the same floral bedspread, but the atmosphere was different, heavier, wrong. I stepped inside, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure it would drown out any sound around me. The door slammed shut behind me, and I spun around, fumbling for the handle. It wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The scratching started again. It came from the closet, just like before, but this time it was louder, more frantic. The door rattled on its hinges as though something inside was desperate to get out. My throat tightened as I backed away, my hands scrambling to find anything to defend myself. The scratching stopped. The silence was so abrupt it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Then the closet door burst open. At first there was nothing but darkness, the kind so deep it seemed to swallow the weak yellow light of the lamp. But then shapes began to emerge, hands, dozens of them, pale and skeletal, clawing their way out of the void. Their fingers dragged against the floor, the walls, the doorframe, leaving behind deep gouges. And then the rest of them followed. Figures crawled out of the closet, twisted and malformed, their bodies contorted in ways that defied logic. Some were missing limbs, others had too many. Their faces were wrong, either blank like the thing in my car or distorted, their features stretched and misplaced like wax sculptures left too close to a flame. They didn't move like humans. They jerked and twitched, their heads snapping toward me with unnatural speed. Their eyes, or the dark pits where eyes should have been, locked onto me, and a chorus of whispers filled the room. It wasn't a language I understood, but the meaning was clear. You brought us here. I stumbled back, tripping over the bed and landing hard on the floor. The things advanced, their movements disjointed but deliberate. The whispers grew louder, the air growing thicker with each passing second. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. One of them reached for me, its hand impossibly cold as it closed around my wrist. The touch burned, sending pain lancing up my arm. I screamed, kicking out at the thing, but it didn't flinch. Its grip tightened, pulling me closer, its blank face inches from mine. You let them see it, whispered, its voice a hollow echo in my mind. Now you belong to them. The others closed in, their hands reaching, their whispers blending into a deafening roar. I fought, thrashing and clawing, but it was no use. They were everywhere, pulling me into their suffocating darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The room was empty. The closet door hung open, revealing nothing but an ordinary, dusty space. The scratches on the walls were gone, the bedspread unwrinkled. It was as if nothing had happened. But I wasn't alone. I could feel them, just out of sight, watching, waiting. The mark on my ankle burned, a constant reminder that they were still with me. No matter where I went, they would follow. They would follow. They weren't tied to the motel or the car or the closet. They were tied to me. And I knew, with a sick certainty, that there was no escape. It felt like an ending, like the kind of moment where the credits roll and the audience breathes a sigh of relief or horror. But for me, it was only the beginning of something far worse. I staggered to my feet, my legs trembling so badly I could barely stand. The room looked normal again, too normal, like it was mocking me. The pale yellow light from the lamp cast soft shadows across the walls, and the closet door stood open, quiet and unassuming. But the weight in the air hadn't lifted. I could feel it pressing against my chest, cold and suffocating. They were still there. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, just beyond the edges of reality. Watching. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, not caring that it was locked. I threw myself against it once, twice, until the flimsy wood splintered and gave way. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I sprinted to my car, flung myself into the driver's seat, and turned the key. Nothing. I tried again, pumping the gas pedal frantically. The engine groaned but didn't catch, as if the car itself had given up. My breathing grew ragged, panic clawing at my throat. I glanced at the windshield and froze. They were there. Dozens of handprints smeared across the glass from the inside. They covered every inch of the windshield, the side windows, even the rearview mirror. My chest tightened as I realized they weren't stationary. The prints were moving, sliding across the glass as though the hands were still pressing against it. Come on, I shouted, slamming my fists against the steering wheel. The engine sputtered once, then roared to life. I didn't wait. I jammed the car into reverse, gravel spraying as I whipped out of the lot. The headlights caught the flickering neon sign one last time, Mo_L, before I sped onto the highway, tires screeching. The road stretched out before me, dark and endless, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance as possible between me and that place. But the further I drove, the more I realized it wasn't just the motel. The handprints didn't disappear. They spread, smearing across the windows like oil, dark and dripping. The air inside the car grew colder, so cold I could see my breath fogging in front of me. And then the whispers started again. They were faint at first, barely audible over the roar of the engine. But they grew louder, overlapping and blending into a cacophony of voices. I couldn't understand the words, but I didn't need to. The intent was clear. They were claiming me. The steering wheel jerked suddenly, pulling the car toward the shoulder. I fought to keep it steady, but it was like something else was driving something stronger than me. The car veered off the road, bouncing over uneven ground before skidding to a stop in the middle of the woods. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. Outside, the forest was impossibly dark, the trees towering like sentinels. The headlights barely penetrated the gloom, casting long, jagged shadows. Then the lights flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness, so absolute it felt like the world had disappeared. My fingers fumbled for the keys, twisting them in the ignition, but the engine was dead. The air inside the car grew heavier, colder, until it felt like I was being crushed. And then the scratching started again. It came from all around me this time, from the roof, the doors, the windows. A horrible, nails-on-metal sound that made my teeth ache. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, crawling under my skin. The handprints on the windows began to glow faintly. A sickly, greenish light that pulsed in time with the whispers that had returned. They weren't faint anymore. They were everywhere, deafening, screaming in languages I couldn't understand, but somehow knew were older than anything I could comprehend. And then the door locks clicked open. All at once. Once. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The darkness outside the car pressed closer, alive with shifting shapes and flickering shadows. I reached for the locks, trying to slam them shut again, but my hands were numb, useless. The first door opened. It was slow, deliberate, the creak of the hinge louder than it should have been. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of decay. I turned, my heart pounding, and saw them. They were standing just outside the car, their blank faces inches from the open door. The glow from the handprints illuminated them in stark, terrible detail. Their bodies were wrong, impossibly tall and thin, their limbs bending in ways that made my stomach turn. They didn't move like humans. They twitched and jerked, their heads snapping toward me in unison. "You belong to us now," one of them whispered, its voice slithering into my mind. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The others closed in, their hands reaching for me, their touch cold and burning at the same time. I thrashed, kicking and clawing, but it didn't matter. They dragged me out of the car, their grip like iron, and pulled me into the forest. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the motel sign, flickering weakly in the distance. Mo_L. And then I was gone.